Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online, as well as those of you who are here with us in person tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. John Avlon has kindly agreed to sign copies of Lincoln and the Fight for Peace after tonight's program. Our bookstore will be selling copies if you are interested. We thank you all for silencing your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. And when Q&A begins, we will provide those of you who are joining us in person, we will invite you to proceed to the microphones that are in the aisles so that you may ask your questions. We are grateful to have this opportunity to explore President Lincoln's work and legacy with our distinguished guests this evening, and I'm now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm so pleased to extend a warm welcome to the Kennedy Library to John Avlon, a senior political analyst and anchor at CNN. He is an award-winning columnist and the author of Independent Nation, Wingnuts, and Washington's Farewell. Previously, he was the editor-in-chief and managing director of the Daily Beast and served as chief speechwriter for the mayor of New York during the attacks of 9/11. His newest book is Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. And I'm so glad to welcome our moderator for this evening to the library, Kellie Carter Jackson. She is the Michael and Denise Kellen 1968 Associate Professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. An award-winning author and a podcast host, she has been featured in documentaries and serves as a historian in residence for the Museum of African American History in Boston and a commissioner for the Massachusetts Historical Commission. Her next book, The Remedy, A Forceful History of Black Resistance to White Supremacy, is in the progress with Basic Books. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thanks for you.
For both of us.
Yeah.
First of all, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Let's try it again. Good evening, everyone.
Oh,
Okay,
I like that.
I like that. The weather is nice. We can smile. We can do call and response. I am so happy to be here. This book is fan-freaking-tastic. I absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
I have so many questions
Great.
for you, but I'm going to start at the beginning because
Okay.
I love a good origin story.
Ooh.
And so I want to know how you came to Lincoln. Did Lincoln come to you? Did you go to Lincoln? How did you start the process for this book? What inspired you?
Great question, and part of that's sort of like author shop talk, you
Yes.
know, which is like, now how do you come up with your ideas? So, obviously, I mean, there have been 16,000 books about Lincoln.
Which is wild.
Right, which is, apparently second only to Jesus. So it wasn't, this wasn't an undiscovered country, but you try to find, and I try to do this in my books, find sort of the universal and the particular. It's what I did with Washington's farewell address. And I found a quote, this goes back probably 15 years ago. You know how sometimes there's a seed of an idea that takes a while to germinate.
Yeah.
And I was procrastinating in a library someplace, and I pulled something off the shelf, and I found an essay about General Lucius Clay by Bruce Catton. And in it, Catton describes how Lucius Clay, who was the general who oversaw the occupation of Germany after the Second World War. He's son of the South, born 30 years after the Civil War, and Germany was sort of, famously the good occupation. These subjects have been relevant given our recent history. And he was asked by a reporter, what guided your decisions during this occupation? And he said, I tried to think what Abraham Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived. And that was so surprising to me and so unexpected in the way that the past was informing the present then, that it stuck with me. And I started thinking about, well, what was Lincoln's plan to win the peace?
Yeah.
And, this is something we still struggle with. We spend a lot of time studying the strategies for winning a war, but we don't spend as much time, not nearly as much time, spending strategies to win the peace.
Yeah.
And so I started digging into what was Lincoln's vision, conversations, speeches, beginning with the second inaugural, the last 6 weeks of his life in particular. And I called up some folks to see, has this been done?
Yeah.
And to my surprise, I remember being at the Abraham Lincoln bookstore in Chicago, and I was talking to Daniel Weinberg, who's the proprietor there. This was a bookstore started by Carl Sandburg in the 1930s. And I asked him, has anybody done this idea? And he looks around at all the shelves and he said, Lincoln the Peacemaker. Well, I'll be darned. No. And the reason the answer is no is because he's assassinated 5 days after Appomattox.
Yeah.
So he never has a chance to implement that vision. And that's why, I think I was maybe able to ferret out a slightly undiscovered country, but with really, I think, deep resonance in Lincoln's soul. I mean, that he was really a man of peace who happened to be president in a time of war.
That's one of the things that you talk about the book so beautifully. The book is so beautifully written. It is so accessible. I say this as a historian because oftentimes historians are writing for other historians, and so no one can understand what we're saying but other historians. But this is so beautiful and so accessible. So kudos for that. But I think that we've all come to Lincoln with different personalities. It's like Honest Abe, or we think of him as the great emancipator. We think of him as, the vampire slayer. We think of him in all of these ridiculous, but also very true ways. Which Lincoln feels truest to you? Because when I think about Lincoln, I don't think I had thought about him as a peacemaker either. But you bring up all of these different examples in the book about how his greatest gift was sort of compassion and mercy, and he was not trying to punish the South in ways that people kind of wanted him to.
Oh, yeah.
He was much more reserved when it came to doling out justice.
He was wary of vengeance because he felt it would perpetuate feelings of resentment, which would erupt into a future war.
Yeah.
He said, no man wants peace more than I, but I'm unwilling to accept peace if it comes on terms that would only guarantee more war, by which he meant he would not simply accept a ceasefire before surrender because he knew you had to deal with the root cause of the war, which is slavery. You asked about what is the heart of Lincoln as I see it. I think it, like many histories, it's a story of character. It's a story of character and action. I think he is defined by empathy and honesty and humor and humility. I think uniquely he's a born reconciler. I think he thinks about reconciliation-oriented leadership in a way that's without precedent, because there hadn't been a civil war on that scale before in human history. So he couldn't draw on other leaders' examples in the way that the founders could say, we're going to draw on consciously the legacies of ancient Greek and Roman republics and how they failed. So he's, in a way, doing this all himself, rooted in no formal schooling, but the Bible, Aesop, Shakespeare. And he really, I think his empathy is his superpower, but I think it's also important to understand him as a flawed human being, as we all are, because it makes his wisdom more accessible, to see him as a man in pain who's in sunshine and shadow. And ultimately, I think the distinguishing feature is what I call the politics of the golden rule. That's a basic idea, but an elusive one. And he really did, he doesn't disappoint. He's kind. He reminds us that kindness is consistent with effective leadership. I think the reason he had such loyalty among the people who were close to him is because they understood that his goodness was the key to his greatness. And I think most of all, for me, and I think politically, is that he combined moral courage with moderation. He was suspect about moral courage slipping into moral superiority, which is an understandable temptation. But he was able to, I think, contain some of his very human emotions to think about the larger cause and effect.
I think that's what makes him such an incredible leader. I mean, this is probably an unfair question to ask, given that we're in the Kennedy Library. You've also written on Washington. When we think about the greatest presidents that this country has ever had, where does Lincoln sort of sit with you? Is he an anomaly because he's faced such unprecedented times? Or you could say that about a lot of presidents, but Lincoln does have this unusual task of having to reunite a country. I mean, a country at war. And not just any war, but you mentioned brother against brother. Like, it's so complex. Do you think his leadership launches him to the top of that list? Is that oversold? Do you know what I mean?
No,
Because
I don't.
We think of Lincoln as like the greatest president ever.
I don't think it's oversold because of the circumstances in which he led, and because of his personal qualities. You know this. You know, you're studying people, and especially if you're trying to understand them as human beings, which is more interesting. You get to know him pretty well over a couple of years, and Lincoln rarely, if ever, disappoints. And even in the few incidents where you can see him losing his temper, and they're very rare, even those are mildly reassuring. And it's born of frustration that he has suppressed because he's trying to think about the bigger picture. I think there's no question he deserves that station as our greatest president. Often these rankings are artificial, although it's interesting to think about the things that go into them and apply them to our own times. But and I think the fact he's such a beautiful writer and such a clear thinker, and he's farsighted but also a great politician, right? He's willing to use transactional goals to achieve transformational, right? Transactional means to achieve transformational goals. And all those things, I think, he stands out in a way that Washington is so self-monitoring that he's not gonna. His achievement is extraordinary in terms of solidifying the Union, but Lincoln saves it, and I think there's a reason people emotionally cotton to him more.
I couldn't agree more. I think about what connects me to Lincoln the most is certainly his speeches, his rhetoric. His ability to connect in very plain English. You know, I didn't think about how you break down the second inaugural speech and you talk about the fact that most of the words that he uses are like one-syllable words. And I was like, I mean, it is the most plain language you can get, and yet so poetic, so spot on. I mean, I'm not gonna read all that, but in the back of the book, there's an appendix that has Lincoln's second inaugural, and there is a part of the speech that's my favorite. It's also a very short speech. He doesn't use
700 words and change.
That's it. And you would think, we've all sat through inaugurations, and you're like, oh my gosh, the 20-minute speech or 30-minute speech. This is a very short speech, where at the end he says. Fondly we do hope, fervently we do pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And every time I read that passage, I'm like, whoa, whoa.
It's deep. No, I mean, it's very Old Testament stuff. We focus on the last paragraph of the speech, which doubles as the last sentence. And that is a New Testament paragraph. That's New Testament leadership, right? That is, life after death, that is, with malice toward none, with charity for all. The rest of the speech is very Old Testament. And it's in the context of the Civil War as collective punishment for the original sin of slavery. And he does a couple things that are really important. And then the response to that paragraph in particular, according to report at the time, is itself really important. First of all, he says very clearly, even though he's a magnanimous person, it's a magnanimous speech, he is speaking as president of the whole Union, not just president of the North, that he says, look, the war is about slavery.
Full
not
stop.
About anything else.
Yeah,
right?
full stop.
And remember, at the time, not just occasionally people in lost cause mythology, there are people arguing this is about constitutional liberty. This is about economic. No, it's about slavery. And if you don't believe him, go read Alexander Stevens' speech. Right? It's
or
about
any
slavery.
secession speech for that matter.
Pretty much, yeah. Occasionally they try to dress it up, but it's, But so he's very clear. But then he does something that speaks to that moral courage without moral superiority. He doesn't let the North off easy, right? He says, implicitly he says, we are complicit too, even if we do not have slaves by and large, because we bought the cotton, we bought the rice. He's very careful to say, and this is an extraordinary statement of empathy several years before this speech, he said, I am not anti-South or anti-Southerner, I am anti-slavery. They are just what we would be if we were in their position.
Yeah.
That's deep.
Yeah.
And so what he's saying is, this is God's collective punishment for the original sin of slavery. I don't know when the war will end because none of us are in charge, including me as the commander-in-chief. Only God knows that. And so he will determine when the war ends, and then uses that Old Testament quote, it's the most spiritual first and inaugural in our history, to say, and that paragraph did two things. It scandalized many folks in the white press, particularly in the South. So you've watched the original reporting around that speech. How dare he say, he'd compare. And then it's also the first integrated inaugural audience, right? Because there are black Union soldiers in uniform attending with their families, and in the recounting, and Frederick Douglass is right up front.
Yeah. And so is John Wilkes Booth.
and John Wilkes Booth's off to the side.
Yeah.
You can see him. He's kind of on the portico, elevated up here in a top hat. Some of the conspirators are right up front. But Douglas is sort of 12 rows back-ish. And at points in the speech, that point in particular, there's the call and response. And the African Americans in the audience responded to that in particular. That line. That's what resonated.
Yeah.
And that is,
because it's almost like Lincoln is the person who is a peacemaker, yes, the person who wants the war to come to an end, but he's also saying in that moment, but all this bloodshed, it's justified. Like where the sin of slavery requires this kind of...
It's divine retribution.
Yeah.
And that we need to proceed in a spirit of humility, both to God, there needs to be moral humility for the original sin of slavery, and recognizing that this suffering that we are all going through is partly penance. And that reconciliation will occur when there's a degree of hard-won redemption. But he's confronting these really issues that we still don't deal with directly. He's dealing with them head on. In 1864, 1865 in that case, I'm thinking of the re-election. It's just a profound, deep speech. And then afterwards, Frederick Douglass comes up to the White House. And he's denied access, and he sends word, and the president intercedes, and Douglass comes in, and Lincoln, sort of a head taller than everybody else, says, well, there's my friend Douglass. Please come up. And he says, what did you think of the speech? I value your opinion more than any man's. And he said, sir, that was a sacred effort. And there wasn't as much of applause at the time because it was short, but it was a sort of a secular sermon. But it is a very religious speech.
Yeah. I mean, the whole time I was thinking the religious themes in this book are so strong because you really sort of can't understand Lincoln without understanding the Bible, without getting the biblical allegories or the connections that he's making. It's the one book, sometimes the only book that people are reading outside of the newspaper. Did having an understanding of Scripture or the Bible allow you to understand Lincoln a little bit more? I mean, most people don't think of Lincoln as a Christian. Some scholars say he's agnostic. Some scholars say it's cultural, what have you. But
well, he's not an Orthodox believer. He's not a member of any particular denomination. And like Washington, often denominations try to claim him and make him a more Orthodox believer than he is. But what is evidently true is that he goes on a faith journey over the course of his life from being a youthful, what they called freethinker, to being more devout, particularly after 1862 with the death of his son Willie. And you can see him. One of the things he uses jokes as a form of self-medication a lot. He uses humor, but also there's this one recounting where he's seen going to read the Book of Job. For comfort. and emerging.
Like, what are you doing?
And emerging. This is the people who vote. And emerging oddly cheerful.
Well, it could be worse.
It could be worse. It could be worse. There's some kind of divine plan. Okay, got it. And the underlined passage on the Bible in which he takes the oath is Isaiah. And there's a lot there. But I didn't go quite this far because I don't want to be sacrilegious, but he's sort of the Jesus of American politics, and not just because he's assassinated on Good Friday, and that was a parallel that people immediately made that Easter Sunday after his assassination, in that he is resolute about meeting hate with love, in public and in private. That's this unbelievable spirit of empathy, which is almost intimidating. And there's so many stories that show it.
Yeah.
Where he just shows grace to people who hate him. And he's able to break down their defenses through gestures of kindness and empathy and understanding. And I think that's one of the reasons that his leadership resonates so much. If you're not coming from a faith-based perspective, but you just love American history, and believe me, I'm interested in American parables. But the role that Lincoln plays and what his wisdom provides is not dissimilar from a lot of, it's New Testament leadership, which is why the Old Testament fixation in the second inaugural is so stark. And that's 90% of the speech.
I wonder, so at the end of the book, I was sort of feeling like, who is America's Lincoln today? Like, how do we think of leaders that have the ability to do that? We live in such a cancel culture. We are at such intense odds. I can't tell you how many times people have brought up the Civil War as a metaphor to thinking about the times that we're living in now, which it's a lot. But as a historian of slavery and Civil War, I was cringe when people do that. But I think about, when you think of these intense moments, no, you can't do this on Twitter, but how do you bring that sort of compassion, that empathy, that love for thy neighbor, the golden rule, to people who are opposing you or in opposition to you? I don't know that I've seen a lot of leaders, political or otherwise, accomplish that sort of balancing act, or the use of honey instead of,
vinegar.
Yes.
It is the most difficult thing to do. And I think if we're honest, empathy in our time has been strained.
Yeah.
There's a poll out today by CNN showing that 63% of Republicans think the last election was stolen. That's tough to reason together with.
Yeah.
But in a democracy in particular, and this is Lincoln's core insight, in a civil war, in a democracy, you can't simply salt the fields. You need to find a way to live together again. And that's where I think the example of Lincoln is resonant. What interests me is applied history.
Yeah.
It's useful wisdom. How can we apply the lessons to our own time, even if it's a very daunting standard? Part of the reason I think it's worthwhile studying the Civil War is simply a reminder that we've been through worse before.
Yes.
And throwing around these Second Civil War metaphors is a total civic sin. On every level.
It really is.
And it's like Clueless on 5 different levels too, because not
Yeah.
only is there not an issue as fundamental as slavery, but states don't have militias they can mobilize against each other and all that stuff. There's another reason to study Reconstruction more.
Yeah.
Because even if you pass constitutional amendments, there's no guarantee that will actually take place in people's lives. And the rolling back of those freedoms is itself a really resonant story. And that's why I sort of continue, go through Andrew Johnson and everything he did wrong as one of our worst presidents. Arguably our worst. And then what Grant did to try to get us back on the Lincoln path, which he does through the Enforcement Act with containing the KKK, which he does for a time. Not
feels
all.
very Obama, Trump, Biden. It feels very.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
People equated Obama and Lincoln, all the time.
Well,
it's false equivalency, sure.
Well, and Lincoln's obviously, Obama's from Illinois. He gives he announces his campaign in front of the old Illinois State House. But that's a lot to put on anyone. I did write this book during the Trump presidency, and I do think, it was medicine to come home to Lincoln at the end of the day after having covered. But in all seriousness, I think what you're also asking is, people sometimes say, well, is there another Lincoln? Will we ever find another Lincoln? And I think it's important to be honest and say no, but we can look for leaders of a similar spirit. And Lincoln's qualities were rare in his time as well, right? I mean, he's known as Honest Abe in his lifetime for a reason. And it wasn't, it's because that quality stood out among politicians, right? He was uncommonly honest. He was uncommonly decent. He used self-effacing humor. There's a lot of rhetorical red meat getting thrown around, and he does not indulge in that in public or in private. So I think that the reconciling leadership that he pioneers and that resonates through, and as I point out in the book, if you look at future Nobel Peace Prize winners, certainly MLK, Gandhi didn't win the Peace Prize but should have, Mandela, Willy Brandt, they all quote Lincoln all the time.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the final images in the book is at Mandela's funeral, there's this painting I would love to find. It's a homemade painting by somebody, but it's Lincoln, JFK, MLK, Mandela, Churchill. It's all these sort of reconciling leaders, and I think
looks like a billboard.
Yeah,
almost.
well, yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, so it's what MLK, Gandhi, JFK, Mandela, Lincoln, Churchill, and Obama.
Yes, yeah.
And I do think that
and Mandela's called Africa's Lincoln.
Africa's Lincoln by his biographer, and that John Carlin, and in the eulogy or the tribute he writes, he explains that he's Africa's Lincoln because both he and Mandela and Lincoln, they didn't rise to political power the way most people do, which is to divide to conquer, right? Instead, they tried to elevate on the basis of common humanity and take a divided system and make it whole and consistent, which is what reconciling leaders do. It's one of the definitions of reconciliation. And that style of leadership is what I think we need to be looking for.
Yeah.
And I think also remembering that, one, character is the indispensable quality in a president. And two, that, people's personalities end up refracting, they get reflected in their principles and then their politics.
Yeah.
So it's not that we're going to find another Lincoln, but we need to be looking for reconciling leaders more and not for people who divide to conquer.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think about the qualities I love about Lincoln the most is the fact that he is able to sort of evolve and pivot. I don't think that, I tell my students all the time, Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but the more he came in contact with Black people, with people like Elizabeth Cleckley, with people like Frederick Douglass, he shifted the way that he thought about freedom and justice and what was necessary. And I think about our leaders today, like who can be confronted with a person or with something and shift and change their position about what they think about, whether it's the Emancipation Proclamation or freedom wholesale, or his changing a position about whether Black people should go back to Africa or whether they can stay in the country. Like, he changes a lot of his ideas. I don't see a lot of leaders that do that, that change their positions.
The evolution of a position. No, it's tough. It seems to be more opportunistic right now, where a strong leader will come and bust open the door, and all of a sudden people will fill the vacuum behind it. But that's different. That's not being responsive to moral suasion, right? Moral persuasion. With Lincoln, I mean, so he is an early, he's adopter. He idolizes Henry Clay. Henry Clay has this idea of, reverse colonization, which it becomes, is for a time, one of the Black war correspondent, Thomas Morris Chester, who's a brilliant writer. He briefly is the editor of the Star of Liberia. Yeah. And then, because he leaves the country and he's like, this place is terrible. And then he comes back, he's like, actually, I'm an American. And,
it's complicated.
And then, he tries to form a militia. The governor of Pennsylvania says no, then he becomes a war correspondent, and he travels with the 25th Corps, which was an African-American regiment. There are 180,000 Black Union soldiers who helped turn the tide of the war and make the war, shift the meaning of the war in fundamental ways because of their own courage under fire. 25 of whom win the Medal of Honor, and we should be building statues to them all over the country. But so Lincoln does evolve on these issues. But, I always repair back, the secession is in response to the mere fact of his election, right? Yeah. The South refuses to recognize its legitimacy, and he's trying to say, look, we have a disagreement about slavery. He's been a single issue candidate since he runs for Senate at least, right? He's a single issue candidate with regard to slavery. But he says, I don't believe constitutionally I have the power to do anything other than stop the expansion of slavery. Because, and that's really what the fight's about. They're all saying, you're going to abolish it, and so therefore it's what's called aggressive defensiveness. We're going to secede and start a civil war in response. in anticipation of you trying to do this. And then what the South does is, as often happens in life, they create the thing they're afraid of. By the end of the war, slavery's gone because that's created an opening. Public opinion shifts in a dramatically different way, in part because of Lincoln's leadership. Now, abolitionists say he's not aggressive enough. There's a lot of griping. Is he a genuine abolitionist or not? I always take Frederick Douglass's speech at a dedication of a statue 10 years after the assassination.
It's one of my favorite
speeches.
It's
a great speech.
It's a great speech. If you haven't read it,
it's really good. It's long, but one of the parts of it, and there are a lot of great parts to this speech, and you got to remember, Douglass is the keynote at a dedication of the first statue of Lincoln, which is paid for by money donated by liberated former slaves. And the Supreme Court's sitting in the front row, President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant sitting in the front row, Frederick Douglass is the keynote.
Yeah.
Right? And here's what he says about Lincoln that I think answers this question of, where is he politically? Did he lead or did he follow? And obviously, it's dynamic in a democracy. But he says, Douglass says, seen from a genuine abolitionist ground, Lincoln could seem tardy, cool, and indifferent. But seen from the perspective of a statesman who is bound to respect and respond to the will of the citizenry, he was zealous, determined, and radical. Right? And I think that captures the balance just about right.
Yeah.
He's acknowledging that the abolitionists did not necessarily see Lincoln as one of his own, but he was the person who was able to shift national opinion.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, he was zealous, determined, and radical.
Oh, and if you're a Southerner, you certainly see him as
that's a whole different
zealous and determined.
Right.
I want to ask a question that I pose to all of my students, usually at the end of every lecture, at the end of we've had a major reading of something.
Ooh, I like that. I want to know this question.
Oh,
That's great.
So it's 3 parts.
Okay.
So I asked them, what is new information? What did they learn after reading this book that they didn't know before? I asked them, what is renewed information? Something that they knew before, but they got reminded of the knowledge that they had. And then the third part is, what is challenging about this book? So I know, if anyone has ever written a book, writing a book is incredibly hard. But through this process, I want to know what was new for you about Lincoln, what was renewed information about Lincoln, and then what is the most challenging thing you have discovered about Lincoln?
All about Lincoln in particular.
Yeah. Or the process of the book in general.
What is the first one is new or renewed?
New. So let's go new.
I can answer this any number of different ways. I underestimated the extent to which Lincoln was thinking strategically about reuniting the nation. 1862 is the worst year of the war. Yeah. Famously, Lincoln insists that construction of the Capitol Dome should continue because he's conscious of the optics, right? But also in 1862, he's working with Republicans in the House and Senate to put forward the Transcontinental Railroad, the Homestead Act, land grant colleges. And the reason for that is to create an architecture by which the nation could be reunited through economic growth and expansion that would move the attention of the nation westward rather than fixating on north-south divides. That's incredibly farsighted.
Yeah.
And that's really, that's creating a structure that he's not, there's no short-term utility for that.
Yeah.
But so he's thinking incredibly long-term in a very deep way.
Visionary.
But practical. Practical. Right? He doesn't think we're going to have a utopian revolution and people's hearts and minds are going to change like that. He's setting up a groundwork to say, okay, we're going to all grow together again in part because people will find optimism in economic expansion. They'll feel invested in a growing country. That was new. Rediscovering, I think it's something that we know. If you care about Lincoln, he seems, if you go to the Lincoln Memorial and look at the portraits, he is heavy, he is melancholy, he is stern, he is solemn. In fact, he tells stories all the time and jokes. And what I realized and deepened my appreciation for is the way that was a tool for him. Right? One, he spoke in parables and he spoke in jokes because he said common people take them as they run. That's what they understand. And that's directly about the Bible and Aesop.
Yeah,
right? That's speaking in parables and using humor in a self-effacing way.
Yeah.
It also is a way to disarm difficult political conversations. And it's also a means of self-medication. This is one of my favorite stories, and it's so resonant out of the book. And it hadn't been told a lot. It's in the memoir of a Chicago congressman named Isaac N. Arnold, who was a friend of Lincoln's from Illinois. And it's 1862, and the Unions just suffered this devastating defeat, and Willie has died. But the battlefield loss is people thought the Union was going to lose the war. Lincoln thought the Union was going to lose the war up until August 1864. And Isaac N. Arnold comes to the White House. And at that time, it's kind of cool. You could just knock on the door and the doorman lets you in. It's very not formal, right? And he gets sent up to the second floor. And he sees Lincoln sitting by the fire. And he's reading a book, and he's laughing. He's reading a book of his favorite humorist, Artemus N. Ward. And Isaac N. Arnold is furious at his friend. He said, "How can you be laughing at a time like this?" And in his memoirs, he says that Lincoln throws down the book and looks up to him with tears welling in his eyes and says, "Don't you realize that if I could not find a way to laugh, my heart would break and I could not do my job?" And so that's a deep Lincoln in pain, but the fact that he's using humor, that's a deepening appreciation for that element of his personality. Most difficult thing, I think, is his relationship with Mary. And it's difficult to write about because it is the source of a great deal of pain, and she's in a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of, in some of the contemporary accounts, Mary is demonized by Lincoln's colleagues in a way that may just reflect the sexism of the day.
Yeah.
Her struggles with, you might want to call it mental illness, might want to call it depression, understandably, may have been compounded by the medications that people were given at the time. And that's an additional degree of complexity. But when you read about their fights and the way it causes physical pain for Lincoln, she criticizes a speech he gives in a carriage with a senator and someone else in the carriage, and I actually took that incident out of the book because I didn't want to appear to be piling on Mary. There's another incident where this is in the book because it's central to, he goes to the front lines for 6 weeks out of the last, 2.5 weeks out of the last 6 weeks of his life. And Mary comes with him and then leaves, and she leaves in part because she's traveling in a carriage with Mrs. Grant. The roads are muddy, they're in City Point, Virginia. Lincoln is going forward to review troops, and he's got his son Tad with him, who's sort of his closest companion. Their relationship's very sweet. And the wife of a general, Mrs. Ord, is on horseback next to Lincoln. And when Mary sees that, she goes into a fury and she says, I bet those soldiers will think that she's the first lady. Right? She's feeling jealous and insecure and anxious and angry. And then at dinner that night, she sort of demands to Grant that that General Ord be fired, and that and it's pain, and Lincoln tries to intercede, and then she gets one of the aides to try to weigh in on her behalf, and Lincoln is apologizing, but he's in pain.
Yeah.
He's embarrassed and he's in pain, and he's trying to sort of contain that, and that's difficult. It's difficult to write about, again, because you want to be fair.
Yeah.
And you, but it is the source of real pain. Another thing I learned, by the way, it's not about him, but it's about Reconstruction and how quickly that door closed. I didn't fully appreciate that the so-called black codes, just the laws that sort of were slavery without the chains, were passed as early as the late summer, early fall of 1865 in a lot of these states. And Andrew Johnson essentially acquiesced. And you can see speeches by former Confederate captains who were clawing back power already, exactly what Lincoln didn't want.
Yeah.
And they're saying, look, we have to accept the fact that slavery is over, but that doesn't mean we need to accept equality. And that happened, that was a very narrow window.
Yeah, very short. The backlash is swift.
Yeah.
Swift. Within a year, the Ku Klux Klan.
Months. Oh, within
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
Ku Klux Klan. But I mean, these codes are being passed, I mean, months after Appomattox.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's all of that's so good. I think that marriages are complicated, right?
Yeah.
Like when you think about who a person is as a leader or a politician versus who they are as a person and as a husband or as a father, two different. I mean, you're really talking about 10 different people in one person.
And they've just had a child die in the White House
Yeah.
and in the middle of the war. I mean, the layers of pain. And so you can't, the emotional ricochets inside themselves, need to have empathy when you're writing about them too.
Absolutely. And of course, they didn't have the kind of language that we have now to talk about mental health. There was no mental health. There was no depression or how people sort of, you mentioned that Lincoln had sort of spouts of depression early on, that his friends hid knives from him. They thought that he might harm himself. They never knew if he was sort of on the brink or not. He seems like a person who was terribly troubled inside, and that I don't know if we ever got to see, Lincoln, he's a peacemaker, but did he ever have peace for himself?
Good question. I think he had moments of peace, and I recount some of them. He goes for a walk with Mary in a trail, but he's tired, especially at the end of the war. He gets genuine joy from being around Tad. He loves playing with his kids.
Yeah.
I think if you look at his writing, you see the result of all that suffering turning into wisdom and tapping into grace, right? I mean, that's what's extraordinary. Is he's a lawyer, so you use all those one-syllable words, but he is the poet of democracy, certainly in the Gettysburg Address and in the Second Inaugural. And I think if you read Lincoln young, I mean, up to the time he's 40, I think one of the things that are driving his bouts of depression is a fear that he will not have done anything in his life to cause himself to be remembered.
Yeah, that's wild.
And that's really troubling him. And he's got one term in
That
Congress.
he won't matter.
That he won't matter. He's done nothing with his life in order to be remembered. And he's got, think about when he's elected president, he's got one term in Congress. He's never held an executive position. He's never run a business. He's never been a governor, never been a mayor, never held a military position. He's an honorary captain in the Black Hawk War, and he jokes about how the most vicious fights he saw were with a bunch of mosquitoes. He's like the least he's the candidate of a third party.
Yeah.
And so he's the least likely person to become president. But I do think that the more he is able to tap in his own life into a deeper sense of purpose where he feels he may have a chance to do something worth being remembered by, some of that salves.
Yeah.
I think.
I wonder what Lincoln would make of what we have made of him. So when you think about, his desire to want to matter in the world, you talk about this in the book too, sort of his Lincoln's memory, like how people call on his example, his leadership, his quotes, his speeches. But do you think the public has a real understanding of Lincoln, or has he become this caricature? I mean, Lincoln gets used in everything from advertisements to, like serious stuff to superficial stuff. Do we have a grasp on who Lincoln is?
I think it's accessible to us, and probably more than most presidents. I mean, right? We have spent the time, and there's the material to work with.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't spend a lot of their own free time trying to know the soul of Warren Harding, or Chester Aitken.
Or Coolidge.
I think presidential history is fascinating in part because it's a character study and it's a study in leadership and all those things. And again, I think the search for applied wisdom, something that President Kennedy used to talk a lot about, not only in Profiles in Courage, but he and Harry Truman. I mean, these were people who understood the responsibilities of citizenship in a democratic republic as being directly informed by the past, and then trying to take those lessons and apply them to the present. And Lincoln was that way as well. I sort of take the broad, good-natured iconography of Lincoln as something heartening.
Yeah.
The fact he becomes a unifying symbol after being a president whose mere election was enough to spur a civil war is kind of impressive, right? But I think speaks to his goodness and his greatness. And for me, it's the way those two things are entwined. You know, if you look at the people who go forward and act as basically apostles, you know, for Lincoln, some of the people who knew him best, or even people who just knew him a little bit, I think what they were carrying forward is this idea that, and you see this a lot in the reminiscences about Lincoln, that he combined goodness with greatness in a way that's really rare, and that his goodness is key to his greatness. And those two qualities don't always go together.
Yeah.
But with Lincoln, they definitely did, and I think that's what makes him inspiring, and that's what makes him, I think, all these qualities are what make him worthy of really deep rumination.
I want to ask two questions. I want to, one, if you could explain the lost cause to the audience, because I think that's really
It's important.
and is the underlying sort of tone of the book is of what Lincoln is combating, not just while he is alive, but after he is assassinated. And then the second question is sort of like, how should we think of the Civil War? I think of the Civil War as one of the most contested war we've ever had. Like Vietnam was contested. The war on Iraq and the war on terrorism, contested highly. But nothing is more contested than the Civil War. Nothing is still being sort of, I don't know, fought intellectually or ideologically than the Civil War.
So you mean the historical the debate over the meaning of the war?
Absolutely. The
Sure.
stakes of who gets to shape this narrative, tell this story, still feels very much at play.
Absolutely. So Lincoln, this is where I think part of Lincoln's genius becomes apparent. You know, his prescription for how you win a peace is the first is unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace. The unconditional surrender piece is important on several levels. Part of it's practical, right? He doesn't want a ceasefire before surrender. He has offered that, he rejects it. Why? Because he's afraid that if there's a ceasefire before surrender, that everyone will celebrate, the war is over, the killing is ended, this is enormously popular, and that will begin a degree of backsliding on ending slavery. Right? But it's also about the meaning of the war, right? And that if you have magnanimous peace following an unconditional surrender, that is the most stable basis for healing these divisions. Civil war is a fundamental fault line in our country and our culture still today, predicated upon the original sin of slavery, and race is just a fundamental fault line in American politics and always has been. You can't understand a lot of the deeper, I mean, from the reason that certain laws are on the books, you know, I mean, you know, it's more with us than we think. That doesn't mean we need to be prisoners of the past, but we have to understand it, right? To that extent, of course, the Civil War is going to be the most contentious war because it's within ourselves, and it's predicated on cultural fault lines and geographic fault lines. But you know, you asked specifically about lost cause mythology, and here's where you see the danger of not winning a peace.
Yes.
Right? Because of the backsliding that occurs under Andrew Johnson, and the way that, that contrary to Lincoln's explicit wishes, he wanted to be magnanimous and give amnesty to the Confederate rank and file. He felt that he'd been misled. But the people who knew better, you know, the former members of Congress, the military, courts, the people who embraced secession, the plantation owners, the power structure, he did not want them to get power back right away. Right? That was really important to him. Now, he wasn't going to hang them, which is the traditional punishment for slavery, or for treason. That's where the magnanimity comes in, but he doesn't want them to grab power back right away. Because that would retrench the old attitudes. Lost cause mythology starts kicking in a couple of years after the war. It's coined, where it is come to symbolize an argument made by an editor of a Richmond newspaper that was codified in a book. And basically it says, the South fought for a noble cause. The war wasn't about slavery. It was about constitutional liberty. The only reason the South lost wasn't through their battlefield heroics or superior strategy, the veneration of Robert E. Lee and Confederate generals that continued until fairly recently, but because of the remorseless industrial might of the North. It was a numbers game. And that there were, you look at the way that history gets rewritten, not only the erecting of the statues, but the film Birth of a Nation is the perfect distillation of lost cause mythology.
Yes.
Right? It's actually the radicalism of the Republicans and the abolitionists that created this terrible division that played out through Reconstruction. And that was the real sin. And of course, it's all about, defending, the white womanhood and, all these layers.
Corruption,
you can also watch Gone with the Wind and you'll get a taste of all this stuff. It's it's deep. Lost cause mythology is pernicious. Think about the fault lines that it draws upon, right? It's blood and soil. Blood and soil ideology. We are defined by our blood, whiteness in this case, soil, the South. It is, we didn't really lose. This was stolen from us.
Yes.
And if we resist it in an organized way, we can fight back and have another shot at winning this. What I just described somewhat inartfully also applies to Germany after the First World War. Blood and soil ideology, a refusal to admit defeat, a belief that they were fighting for a noble cause, a blaming people at home, right? It's not our fault, it's their fault. People far away, the financiers, shadowy characters, but also their Jewish neighbors next door. And that we are going to try to dignify that cause by a new militarism built upon those fault lines and practice aggressive defensive-ness, trying to claw back power. Aggressive defensiveness is a term that's, it's very resonant today if you study a lot of the militias that are out there. But, also during Reconstruction, it was that they would have a couple of folks trying to start fights whenever Republicans or African Americans were meeting, and particularly in the South, use that as a pretext for violence and basically go on like multi-day killing sprees, saying it was retaliatory. It was defensiveness. It's aggressive defensiveness. So that lost cause mythology is really pernicious, and you can see in it a lot of those roots to those sort of violent tribal politics. Not only on our own nation, but again, I think you can draw a fairly direct parallel to those appeals and what happened in Weimar Germany.
Oh, for sure. Some of the same criticisms of linking you list in, I believe, in the introduction, where they're saying, well, Republicans want, black people to have rights, and these women have taken it too far. They want women to have rights.
The Collier, you're talking about the Collier's cartoon?
Yes, and the political cartoon is literally every single grievance that you see.
It's amazing. Let's talk about the Collier's cartoon, because it's really wild. So it's in the middle of the book. It's this Collier's cartoon. Clearly we're having too much fun, but we're going to have time for Q&A for y'all.
It's okay.
So you got to remember a couple things. First of all, the Republican Party is in effect a third party. It is a moderate progressive party. It is a big tent coalition of abolitionist parties and people who merely want to stop the spread of slavery and former Whigs and complicated relationship with the know-nothings. But it's a big tent party, basically dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery, but it's got all kinds. And it is derided by the Democrats, who are at the time a conservative populist party. It is rural. It is predominantly in the South, and they want to conserve slavery, the Constitution as it was, right? And there's this cartoon in Collier's at the time. I love political cartoons, and it shows Lincoln being led into an insane asylum on a rail, and he's beardless, right? So it's 1860, and journalists are carrying him in, but it's the trail of special interest behind him that are so fascinating, right? So tell me what I'm missing. But there's sort of a dandified caricature of a black man saying, "There are no white man's rights we are bound to respect."
Yeah.
Then
I was like, what?
There's a long-haired guy holding hands with another man saying, "I represent the free love element."
Yeah.
There's a woman, a sort of elderly spinster, I forget what she says.
Yeah, I want women's rights enforced and a man reduced in subjugation to her authority.
Right. Okay. Now remember, this is before like
I want
80 years
everybody
before.
to have a share of everybody else's property.
That's the socialist. There's a socialist, right?
It's a lot. I want
And
a
at the-
hotel established by the government where people that ain't inclined to work can board free of expense and be found in rum and tobacco.
Right. So that's the ne'er-do-well alcoholic saying, I want the government to pay for me to drink and I don't want to work. So there's fear of welfare. There's fear of
Yes.
sort of feminism. There's
Yes.
fear of blacks, gays. I mean, it's
everything.
all there. It's all there in the cartoon. It's that same caricatured coalition of people who say they're backing the moderate progressive party, that they're really radicals, and they're it's directly resonant.
Yes, yes.
And
There's
that's
straight lines. Some things are just straight lines to the
boom,
present.
all of it. And again, this is way before African Americans and women had the right to vote, let alone any of the other stuff. So it shows you how deep that stuff is.
I love it. We need to take questions from the audience, but
Yeah.
I just have to reiterate, this book is so timely. It is so resonant. It is so fresh. It is absolutely about the past and the present and the possibility of the future.
Hope so.
It is all of that in this book. So let's take questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, please come to the mic. That's really important. We want to hear you.
And then we've got questions from online as well, which I think we're going to get. So, yes, sir.
Hello. Thank you for coming. I hope this question isn't stereotypical, but I've noticed that your early childhood was in the South, in Charleston.
Okay.
Oh, it may be incorrect, but your education was Milton Academy.
Yeah.
And did that affect your way of thinking, your philosophy? Was there a clash of cultures?
I appreciate that. Not really, except I think it made me a little more resistant to buying into stereotypes about how deeply divided the nation is. I was born in New York. My folks moved to South Carolina when I was 14, which is when I went away to school. But I think very often we do ourselves and our fellow citizens a disservice by thinking that somehow the character and the culture of the country change when you travel across a certain state. And I think, there's a lot of things I love about the South. And a lot of the,
Same.
particularly in the North, stereotypes about the South are really often fundamentally wrong, right?
Agreed.
And here's one way to do it. The real underlying divisions in our politics that are eternal and probably everywhere are certainly not liberal versus conservative. They're not red state, blue state. They're urban versus rural. Those debates are seen in the debates of ratification of the Constitution. Now, it just so happens, especially in the early days of the country, that with the couple exceptions, Savannah, Charleston, most of the cities were in the North, and it was more agrarian in the South. But if you go back and look, and I did this for a reality check, a year or so ago, every major urban area in the South, except for I think Oklahoma City, voted for Biden over Trump, Hillary over Trump, and Obama. Which is to say that there's more that unites us than divides us.
Yeah.
And so part of my frustration is when we buy into these divisions about being these narratives about America being deeply, unalterably divided, particularly when it comes to north-south lines. I don't buy it. You got to understand the history. When we first moved down there, you could see relics of the war in northern aggression. When I gave this book to some of my folks' friends, I was amazed how many wonderful sort of elderly gentlemen who love American history said, wow, this is great. I didn't learn a lot about Lincoln when I was growing up. He was really impressive. and part of the reason for doing this, I think, is when we talk about our history, we need to emphasize, I think, stories that unite us, but it can maybe take the pressure down a little bit. It can pose this perspective on our political debates. And that's one of the things I hope that I'm able to do.
If I could, just a quick follow-up question, balancing which one to ask. If Lincoln had not been assassinated, where would the country have been?
Okay, to briefly answer an impossible question.
That's exactly why I asked.
Look, it's clearly one of those hinge points that changes the trajectory of the nation. Would he have made new mistakes that we can't imagine? Yes, of course. Would he have done what Andrew Johnson did? I believe the answer to that is strongly no. From the abolition of the Freedmen's Bureau to the vetoing of the early Civil Rights Act to the pulling black troops out of the South to so it would have been fundamentally different, and I think we would have been vastly better for it. We would have made long strides towards winning the peace. It wouldn't have been anything resembling utopia. But there are certain hinges where you can see history change. I think the assassination of the Kennedy brothers is one. You can get more tactical about election results, but I think clearly Lincoln is in that category.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
My question is, how did Lincoln deal with people like Edwin Stanton, who was like, as far as I'm concerned, a lunatic? I mean, he was just like, get everybody out of here, everybody, you know. And he was constantly arguing with Lincoln. But Lincoln seems to have taken his cabinet seriously and listening to everyone, and then finally making a
Sure.
pretty darn good decision, you know. But Stanton stands out as like, you know.
I love that you're still like, that you feel so strongly about Edwin Stanton. That's great. Look, famously, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Boston's own, wrote Team of Rivals. Lincoln was very good, as I think really confident leaders should be, about surrounding themselves with strong personalities with different opinions, and then taking their counsel and making his own judgment. And he, the last days of his life, last cabinet meeting, he was already feeling pressure from radical Republicans who wanted to have a much more radical version, rip the South out for roots, destroy the state lines, all that stuff. And he said, no, we need to treat them as people. His relationship with Stanton, I think, is overstated. Stanton certainly is imperious. He does not always play well with others. And Lincoln, he can deal with these irascible personalities with a slight degree of distance. It helps to be president. But he actually had telegraphs and everything shows a good working relationship with Stanton. And I think he probably used him as bad cop sometimes, which can be helpful if you're a good person. Yes, sir, you, and then you.
Your talk reminded me of a little book that came out in the 1970s, Lincoln's Religion. It was written by a professor at Episcopal Divinity. But my question is, the Bible is filled with violence.
Yes.
It's filled with murders. It's filled with people taking other people into slavery. And even in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says, treat your slaves nicely. So how did Lincoln react to all of the acceptance of slavery from the scriptures?
Well, it's funny. There were, among other things, biblical defenses of slavery, as you say. The war's really about constitutional liberty. Actually, Woodrow Wilson's father was minorly famous for publishing a pamphlet exactly on biblical defenses of slavery.
Wow.
So
Not surprising.
In retrospect, look, if we take different passages of the Bible, you need to understand them in historic context. That's true, but you also need to weigh it against the overwhelming moral lessons. And Lincoln addresses this many times in a biblical framework. He does it with a moral imagination, right? So he says, I knew of no good thing that any man did not want for himself, right? So therefore, this is the golden rule. This is the politics of the golden rule. Treat other people as you would like to be treated. Would you like to be enslaved? Whenever I hear someone defending slavery, Lincoln said, I have a strong impulse to see it tried on himself. And so I just think that the core, basic, fundamental teachings of Jesus, let alone, you can find the golden rule in the Talmud as well. Treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated. I think the line is, that is the sum total of wisdom in the Torah. Everything else is details. So that, I think, trumps, verb that's lost its currency, overrides all those things. And I think you can come up with biblical defenses for everything. I think biblical defenses for slavery shows the counterfeit weight of that argument to me. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. I would like to find out why it has to take the 16th president, as horrendous as slavery was, for the insight or possibility to come for abolition. That we have all these 15 earlier presidents. And if slavery was still going on and Lincoln really won the emancipation, how come he didn't send, like, say, a commission to the African land? Because these are African chiefs, empires, kingdoms, and they were minding their own business until this transatlantic slavery thing was forced, on them by the Europeans. But I always wonder if, say, he has been able to commission people, probably in those days may have been very difficult, but to at least go to the African land Who are the African people? Who is the black man? What did they have? What is unique about them that the average human being doesn't have that has to cast them so low? They should have seen the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Sonia Empire. They have their palaces, they have gold, diamonds, everything. Will that have changed the world's perspective of the black man as a slave? So it's something that puzzles me, because until we really go in to really redefine the black man to America, to white America, to the world, we will continue to be not offend any institution that you are in. Almost 50 years in America, it's just that it puzzles me.
I understand.
How very little that this great nation we have knows so little about who black people are. And I pride in my African upbringing, the foundation, the drive, the zeal. We want to get out of poverty. You know, whatever we see with Ukraine, as heartbreaking as it is, that is what colonization also did. They destroyed, they killed, you know, so like you have this continent going through slavery from the 17th or 16th century to the 19th century. Then the 19th century, a whole new set of Europeans also arrived to colonize, to plunder. So it's so complex. I wonder if somebody has been sent to Africa at the time to see what is worth of the black man. Probably we will be more on an equal level.
Well, there's so much in your question, and at the heart of it is a what if that, of course, I can't answer. You know, one of the things I think is important about studying our history is to not try to apply our perspective wholesale about the past, but to not surrender our moral judgments either. There's a balance there, if only because future generations will look on us as barbarous and idiots about something, or more than one thing, no matter how enlightened we try to be. We are all people of our time, but you know, some people are trying to move history forward, and some people are trying to, you know, keep established institutions in place, of which slavery is clearly the most horrific. The movement towards abolition, certain states pass it earlier. England with Wilberforce sets an example of how to do it peaceably, albeit in a much more limited context, right? There was, as I mentioned earlier, you know, one of the vestiges of a recolonization movement or decolonization movement. There were educated free blacks who, in some cases, went back, tried to colonize Liberia, and it didn't take for a number of different reasons. But you know, that idea also clearly is an off-ramp reflecting white supremacy itself. I think when you understand American history, first of all, let me just say two things quickly, because there's an endless number of things we can say about your question.
Yeah.
The Constitutional Convention, one of the things that's important that happens in the early abolition movement is the notes on the Constitutional Convention are published. And for the first time, people are able to see some facsimile of the debate that the Constitutional Convention had about slavery. And basically that, you can call it a corrupt bargain, but it came down to the fact that we couldn't get ratification of the Constitution with all 13 colonies if some states, as they wanted to do, insisted on ending slavery. America would have been stillborn at the start. So you can say that's an unacceptable compromise from our perspective. But one of the things they did was the transatlantic slave trade is banned in 1808. And that is part of an intentional effort to contain slavery and have it, they believed, slowly age itself out of existence. When the Mexican-American War, which Lincoln opposed, occurs, we get a lot of new land, and a compromise bill, be careful, you know, I'm a centrist in many respects, but be careful with some compromises, starts bringing new states into the Union, some slavery, some free. That lets the genie out of the bottle. That's Pandora's box, right?
Yeah.
And that really is what sets us on the path to civil war, because that argument that slavery was going to be contained and slowly extinguish itself no longer becomes operative. So these are deep debates. They are many not satisfying from our contemporary perspective. we are still, I think, working on obviously many of these fundamental issues. And I do think that one of the things we need to keep in mind, particularly, I look forward to reading your next book, but with Reconstruction, is when you understand that there is a resistance to multiracial democracy based in fear, which has deep roots in the American experience. And one of the reasons to understand history is to look in the rearview mirror and say, who was on the right side of that debate? And if you hear people making echoes of those arguments, they're probably going to be on the wrong side of that debate ultimately as well.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. I'm here as a representative for our online audience.
Hello, representative of online audience.
So, question from the audience. Whenever people mention Lincoln, it's usually in relation to his role in the Civil War for obvious reasons. What would you say is his biggest accomplishment in international affairs?
That's a good question.
It is a good question. First, I think defending democracy on the world stage. Remember, and I lay this out in the book, you know, America's the largest, and in some respects, sole constitutional democratic republic on the world stage at that time. So a lot of people, when you read the newspaper coverage at the time, in Europe, all those aristocrats and autocrats and monarchists are always saying, like, we told you so. We told you this foolish experiment would fail. Freedom is inimical to the human experience. There need to be hierarchies, and they're just waiting for America to break up so they can basically recolonize us. So one of the things Lincoln does by winning the Civil War on the grounds he does is defend democracy, the integrity of democracy, not just American democracy, but the idea of democracy's durability itself. Second thing is he removes, and this is a big subject going back to the debates with Stephen Douglas, part of what so offends Abraham Lincoln about slavery is the fact that it deprives America of its moral example on the world stage. It's a fundamental constitution to the premise and the promise of all men are created equal.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that we are fighting for. And I think that, you know, one of the things that gets lost in American history but occasionally bubbles up is, remember, we are an anti-colonial power from our roots. Right, and I think when those lines get lost, you know, our moral stature is diminished. So there's a lot there. You can also glibly say he kept Britain from backing the Confederacy. Yeah. That's really William Seward. A lot of credit for that. But yeah, I mean, what we were defending had enormous foreign policy repercussions that ultimately changed the world.
Can I also add? Like,
please.
I always tell my students that during the Civil War, for the longest time, Haiti would not get diplomatic recognition. And during the Civil War, Lincoln basically says, hey, we need to go through, we need to keep our naval blockade around Florida. Haiti, will you help us out? And Haiti's like, sure. In exchange, we want diplomatic recognition that we are a sovereign nation, the only black nation in the Western Hemisphere, and they get it as a result of the Civil War. But I think people always forget about Haiti, so I just have to throw that in there.
And the whole role, I mean, the whole role of Haiti's independence is actually much more formative to fundamental American debates for good and for ill. I mean, in the South, it's a fear-based thing. Yeah. It's really, I can't wait to read your next book.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right, Professor Jackson and Mr. Avlon, thank you for being here. It's very informative. What was President Lincoln's relationship with General Grant? And I have a couple of questions in regards to the South. I love the South. How did he view the South? And had he been to the South? And did he see himself, as many Northerners did at the time, superior to Southerners?
No.
That's a good question.
Yeah, so great questions. So yes, he had been to the South. As a young man, he takes a flat riverboat trip down to New Orleans. And on that trip, he actually sees slaves for the first time in chains, and that's one of the things that sort of awakens his conscience to slavery. And I think it's one of the reasons he fixates on Louisiana and New Orleans as being a laboratory for Reconstruction. Is he also knew from that trip that, you know, they had a Creole class, they had they had the elements of a multiracial democracy that he hoped could actually be lead America. In addition to the fact that New Orleans had been under Union control longer than any other city in the Deep South. He's born in Kentucky.
Yeah. Slaveholding state.
Slaveholding state. His wife's siblings, many of them are Confederates. One of the heats, he takes a lot of heat, and Mary, when her sister's husband is a Confederate general. He is killed in battle. She asks to come visit them. And he allows for her safe passage. And people say, why are you coddling the enemy? She hasn't renounced secession. She hasn't renounced slavery, but it was also sending a message about family.
Yeah.
This is a family fight. And that quote I said to you earlier, I'm not, I'm anti-slavery. I'm not anti-South or anti-Southern. They are just what we would be in our position. That, right? That's an amazing act of empathy and wisdom that sort of, love the sinner, hate the sin. That I think he exemplifies. Grant, he spends a lot of time with Grant in the last 6 weeks of his life. Grant invites him up to City Point. Here's one of the contradictions in Lincoln that's kind of interesting. He is a man of peace, but he is constantly prodding his generals to be more aggressive. Right? I mean, he is absolutely furious with Meade.
It's like, please charge.
Would
please
you
fight a battle.
Yeah. And he has really caustic letters, right?
Yeah.
He has one, McClellan asks for more horses and reinforcements, and he says, I hope you forgive me for asking what your horses have done that would have tired them out recently. He rails against Meade for letting Lee escape. And in Grant, he gets somebody who is aggressive. And he said, I can't spare this man. He fights. And that's
Sherman,
and Sherman, and those two are brothers. One of my favorite quotes about friendship is from Sherman to Grant, and he said, I stood by him when he was drunk, and he stood by me when I was crazy, and now we stand by each other always.
Thank you.
I love it.
I now have 2 questions for you.
Great.
One reason Canada united was fear of Northern Army marching north. What were Lincoln's views on Canada? Was there correspondence, Canada's founding father, Sir John A. Macdonald? And did Lincoln have a Ted Sorensen as a close aide?
Ooh. I'm sure there is someone who is an expert on Lincoln in Canada. I don't think they're on this stage right now.
No, I was going to say, my friend Dan would know. He wrote a whole book about
Call
Canada.
Dan. Can we get a lifeline? Call Dan. No, the only,
I don't know about his relationship with Canada.
Well, there are some incidents that I do know about. So some Confederates actually steal up to Canada, and they lead sort of terrorist runs on a couple of towns in Vermont.
Wow.
And at the end of the war, Lincoln's getting some reports that some leading Confederates are trying to escape the country, including one who's up in Maine, I think, and he's trying to get to Canada. And he basically says, let him go. He's got his stories. This is one of Lincoln's parables. He's got 2 versions of this. But one is a story about a man who's taken a abstinence pledge from alcohol and goes into a bar on a hot day. He's alone there, and his friend's the barkeep, and he asks for a lemonade. And he says, sure. The bartender says, would you like me to put a little nip of whiskey in that? And the man says, well, sure, as long as you did it unbeknownst to me. And the idea being that, if he were allowed, if this Confederate leader were be allowed to escape unbeknownst to Lincoln to Canada, so you don't have to make a martyr out of him, but he would just disappear, that would be just fine. But that is the limit of my Lincoln and Canada knowledge, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, no, for Canada, I mean, I can only speak of it in terms of like the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement.
Yes.
Because Canada was the Mason-Dixon line, effectively after the Fugitive Slave Law. The only place you could go to sort of get safe haven was Canada. And so a lot of Black people go to Canada and set up free Black communities there, and they stayed there until the Civil War, which I think is really fascinating. Like Mary Ann Shadd Cary is an American. She goes to Canada, starts a newspaper, and when the Civil War breaks out, she was recruiting Black people to come to Canada. And then she leaves Canada and recruits Black men to fight in the war, along with Martin Delany. And she never goes back to Canada after that. I think that after the Civil War, Black people finally started to see America as a place that they could stay in. But those tensions are very much there. I don't know how it involves Lincoln, but certainly Black Americans.
As it turns out, there is an expert on the Civil War candidate on the stage. It's just not me. That was,
It's not
that
me
was
either.
great. That was great.
It's not me either.
I love it. Yes, sir.
You started the conversation mentioning that Lincoln was strategizing all the time towards peace. Did he do his due diligence with the selection of Andrew Johnson as a running mate?
So, this is, Lincoln's worst decision is his most impactful. You got to understand it again in the context of the time. This is one of the things that historians try to do is, okay, what information did the people have at the time? Johnson's selection on paper makes a lot of sense in 1864. Lincoln doesn't run for re-election as a Republican. He runs on a national unity ticket. Johnson is the only Southern senator who doesn't secede with his state. He had owned slaves. He finds religion on the subject, frees them. He becomes a military governor of Tennessee, and he says treason must be made odious. He's what's known as a war Democrat. And a lot of the radical Republicans like Johnson more than Lincoln, including one of them, Benjamin Wade, said towards the end of Lincoln's life, that he hoped Lincoln would be assassinated because Johnson would be tougher on the South. And what people misread about Johnson is useful. He's not a race warrior. He's a class warrior. He's motivated by resentment. As a poor white who didn't have money to have a slave, a lot of poor whites were really angry at slavery and slaveholders because it made a fundamentally unequal economic situation. They would never be able to compete with people who had slaves as property working in their firms. And then he also is a person who has no magnanimity. He is not a reconciler. He is alternately radical and reactionary. He's very susceptible to flattery. He gives all the amnesties when people come and ask for him. He pulls Southern black troops from the South for fear of offending. He acquiesces and passes the black codes. He stops the Freedmen's Bureau, which is an enormously important public-private institution. He stops it from going forward, which could have made a meaningful difference. And that goes back to 40 Acres and Mule and all those sort of, not quite promises, but the idea that you were going to help lead former slaves to self-sufficiency and create a landowning class of freed black farmers in the
Reparations,
South.
basically.
A form, yeah. I mean, reparations conversation gets real
Yeah, I know, that's
complicated,
murky, but yes, a form of.
But they were actually, anyway, Johnson does things that are totally antithetical to Lincoln because he is misjudged. Lincoln takes too much comfort in the fact that he's known Johnson from his one term in Congress. He takes a lot of comfort from having old friends. But when Johnson shows up drunk at the second inaugural, and Lincoln is furious, he doesn't talk to him. Johnson comes up to visit him at City Point. Lincoln refuses to see him. The one meeting they have is on the day Lincoln dies to sort of fill him in on what's happening in the cabinet meetings. But there hadn't been a president assassinated to that point. Now Lincoln is very aware that he is under threat of assassination, but it hadn't happened at that point. But on paper, we're gonna have a Southerner on the ticket who's anti-slavery. But it just goes to show you, to reinforce that main point, that character is the indispensable quality in a president. And I'll close with this, on this question anyway. Andrew Johnson, there's a quote about him that was in the Atlantic Monthly at the time, contemporaneous, and they describe him as being thin-skinned and vain, egotistical to the point of mental disease. Character, most important quality in a president.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are going to wrap up. Are there any other questions I want to pose before we wrap up? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to say thank you to you,
It was a great
John. This was
conversation.
amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to the
That was great.
audience. You are an
Yes.
amazing audience. Go out and get Lincoln and the Fight for Peace.
And I'll go sign him in the back.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fantastic. This was
Really appreciate
fantastic.
it.
Your book is amazing.
I can't wait to read yours. It's
Oh
gonna be
man,
great.
well, it'll be up June 2024.
Okay, so we got.
So we've got some time.
Well, have
I'm
you
still
handed
making
it-
edits.